All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're just a minute past noon, so I thought we could go ahead and get started. Welcome to Become a Citizen Historian, a Preservation Month presentation. Before we get started, I wanted to share with you some information about Preservation Month 2025. So every year, the US and San Antonio, of course, celebrate Preservation Month. Here in the Office of Historic Preservation, we do that by offering events like this one, and then also by sort of boosting other preservation-related events happening across the city. If you want to know more about Preservation Month events, you can go to saspeakup.com and search for Preservation Month. I'll do a couple quick plugs. So on Saturday evening rather, we're doing Picnic and a Movie in the city's East Side cemeteries. We're showing Goonies, and there'll be popcorn and snacks, and I think it'll be a really fun time. And then on Saturday, May 17th, we're having sort of our signature Preservation Month event, our Home Repair Fair. Y'all may know this by its former name, the Historic Homeowner Fair, but we're trying to be a little more inclusive this year because the same tools that folks use to repair and maintain their historic homes can be used on any home. All of our homes are aging, so these are contractors that can be helpful to you. We'll have some on-site demonstrations this year, which will be really fun, and I hope to see you all there. So my name is Jessica Anderson. I work with the Office of Historic Preservation. I'm the Assistant Program Manager for our Deconstruction and Circular Economy program. But in my previous lives with the office, I worked with Scout SA, which is the program that designates historic structures, historic districts, and also does general property research. If somebody's requesting a demolition, that's the entity that looks into properties to see if they're eligible for designation. So in this presentation, we're going to cover the free research tools that are available to you online and what kind of information you'll find there. And then we'll talk a little bit about how our office also uses these tools to build narratives about properties and also provide guidance to property owners about the treatment of their homes and buildings. And all of these research tools are available today largely because of the genealogy desk at the Central Library. They have both hard copies of these and also sort of manage access to the online databases that we're going to go through today. I'm a big fan of encouraging people to go see these materials in real life. We'll talk a little bit about it as we go through, but the maps that we're talking about, when you see them in person, you can really see sort of the hands that made them. You can get a sense of their size and their scope a lot better than you can online. So if you have an opportunity to visit the Texonnet and Genealogy Room at the downtown library, I highly recommend it. Debbie, who works there, is so helpful too. If you get stuck in your research, you're not sure what your next move should be, she would be glad, I'm sure, to provide some additional guidance to you. And then this is also my plug for you to get your public library card. You can access these materials anywhere, anytime, as long as you have a MySAPL card. If you don't have a physical card yet, you can get sort of temporary access to these online databases if you sign up online at this URL. But eventually you'll have to make your way to your local branch to get your official card. But I highly recommend doing so, not only for your own benefit, but also to support our public library. I will also add now, before we dive in, that I would much rather have a conversation with y'all rather than just kind of lecture at you. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, but if you have any specific questions as we go, please drop it in the chat for Become a Citizen Historian, and I will answer those as they pop up. And then I'll also leave time at the end, hopefully, to answer some questions and do a little bit of a live run through of some of these materials. And if at any time you guys have trouble hearing me, also please let me know. Okay. So I've been doing this research for a while now and have kind of figured out the best sort of order of operations for these tools that we use. You can always figure out what works best for you once you get to know the materials, but I'm going to kind of take you through my process, my thought process as I go through these in order of how I typically use them. So first up are Sanborn fire insurance maps. I don't think that this format allows me to ask folks to raise their hands if they are familiar with Sanborn fire insurance maps already, but this was basically sets of hand-rendered maps that allowed insurance companies to estimate potential losses if there was a fire of a structure that they were covering. For San Antonio, that coverage goes from 1885 through 1952. And then that's through the SAPL online database for Sanborns. But you can request 30 Sanborns from the genealogy desk, and I'll share that email address again later. The black and white maps are all available through SAPL. There's also color maps that are available through the Library of Congress and then also through the Perry Castaneda Library. So if you find a map of interest in the SAPL database, you can sort of move to the Perry Castaneda Library, get a little bit more information from the color maps. I'll talk about that again in a couple slides. And then just to reiterate that you can request 30 maps from the genealogy desk at sanantonio.gov. So the reason that I start with Sanborn maps is because the maps can give us a lot of good information about street name changes over time and then also house number changes over time. So this helps us build a really reliable set of sort of research parameters. So if we know that a property had a different address, when we move on later to look in our city directories, which are kind of like the phone book, we know that we have to look it up under the address that we know it, but then also these previous addresses that we might find through the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So here's an example of the color Sanborn maps. So every volume of the Sanborn fire insurance maps are sort of organized the same way. So there's an edition, which just really means the years covered. Volume, early, the 1800s ones, for example, will only have one volume of maps. Starting in 1904, there are 2 volumes of maps. And then 1911 and later, there are 6 volumes of maps. So kind of an interesting way to think about not only coverage, but also how much the city had grown over those years, that it had to expand the number of volumes to cover San Antonio. Each volume also has a key, so you can kind of see down here on the bottom right. This shows you how to read the information on the Sanborn maps, whether that's materials information for the color maps. They include some notations on each property that can tell you what the structure was made out of, how many stories it is, what kind of roof it had, information like that. And the keys can change volume to volume, so you always want to make sure you're looking at the key for the volume you're looking at. And then each edition also has, or each volume rather, has its own index, and this is organized by street name. And so you can see here, for example, for Nevada Street, Nevada house numbers 100 through 232 Nevada are going to be covered on page 248. So here's a couple of side-by-side comparisons of Sanborn maps to show you the kind of information that you can find there. So this house, it was one that was brought by an owner for designation. She wanted to landmark her house. It was 241 East French Place. So here's that 1951 Sanborn map. We can see it's listed as 241 East French Place, but then in parentheses on the same street, it says Indo Street. And so when we see information like this, that means that this street was previously Indo Street. And so now we know, perhaps in the earlier map, I tried to find East French Place and it wasn't there. Now I know I need to go back to that map and look for Indo Street. And then here's our structure again, listed as 308 Indo. This is kind of another code-breaking thing with Sanborn maps. You'll see on these properties that there are 2 numbers listed. The one closest to the structure is the address it had at the time the map was made. And then the one further from the structure was a previous address. So just from these 2 maps, we know that when we search for this property, either in our city directories later on, or if we maybe want to do some newspaper research with this, that we have to look up 241 East French Place, as well as 308 Indo and 137 Indo. Some other interesting information that you can get from Sanborn maps that's really well illustrated here. In this earlier map, we can see kind of the original footprint of the structure. So it was this sort of cute T-shaped structure, but then by 1951, there's an addition on the rear of the house. Some ways that we might use this information from like a design review perspective, perhaps a future owner wants to greatly modify this addition, or maybe they want to demolish this addition and build a new addition. We have a sense of, whether that was part of the original footprint. It helps us decide whether we want to treat it as an historic addition to the structure and want to be sensitive to it, even though it's not part of that first footprint. It just helps helps us better manage the decisions that we make when we're advising property owners of how to treat their historic properties. I feel like I'm flying through this, so please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat. So this is sort of to illustrate the importance of looking at both the black and white maps and the color maps, because you can get different levels of information on them. So on the left is that 1912 black and white map, the one that doesn't have the rear addition we talked about, but it also doesn't have this information where the buildings show up in different colors. So you can see here that most of the buildings around our subject structure here, which is that 241 East French Place, most of them are yellow. And so we look at our key here, and it says that yellow means it's a frame building, so wood frame building. But then our subject structure shows up in pink, which means brick building with brick or metal cornice. And then this shows brick building with a frame cornice. So if it had this little sort of dotted line, it would be different, but our structure is just this solid pink, and it means a brick building with a brick or metal cornice. So Lauren just dropped a question in the chat. Why again do these maps exist, and how far do these maps go? So these maps were drawn, as I mentioned, for a fire insurance company to basically help them anticipate the costs if these structures were lost due to fire. So it's basically part of their estimate processes for coverage. In San Antonio, the maps go back to 1885, and then the coverage goes through 1952. And so you can see here on the color maps, you can get information about what the structure was made of, so wood frame construction versus brick construction. On each of these houses too, on our subject structure, for example, there's a 1 here in the corner. That means it was a 1-story structure. It has an X on the top. So if we go over to our, I think it got cut off on this one. So, here it is. So X on the structure means it's a shingle roof. And then you can also see some of these structures have like a little space with a dotted line around it. That denotes a porch. So it's not a fully enclosed space. It means there's a roof over an open porch. So Julie says, my house is the only one on my street in the 1911 map, but my neighbor said their home was built in 1910. So something that's really interesting about build dates in San Antonio, and I mean nationwide, honestly, a lot of dates are shared by word of mouth. There's also a lot of dates that get assigned in the Bexar County Appraisal District, and those dates might not be correct. So that's part of the thing that you can do through like property researchers. You can confirm information like that. So in theory, if you wanted to be a good neighbor, you could share this information with your neighbors and say, hey, here's how you can learn more about your property. What I would recommend they do in that case is look at the Sanborn maps, figure out its earliest appearance. Based on the information you gave me, it means that their house couldn't have been built before 1911. But maybe the city directories, which we're going to talk about in a second, is another tool that they can use to kind of hone in on a correct build date for that structure. Okay, so Rebecca asked a question in the chat. Can you please state again how these maps are accessed? I'll go through this in a little bit, but I think this is actually a good thing to bring up because I think I kind of skipped over it a bit. So I'm going to pull up the website so mysapl.org is the public library's website. And Rebecca, I'm using all resources that are available for free through MySAPL. Once you get to the landing page, if you go to services, there's a databases link, and then it lists all of them alphabetically. Sanborn maps are listed under Texas Digital Sanborn Maps. Why they chose that instead of putting it under S for sandworms, who knows? But in SAPL, Texas Digital Sandworm Maps, you could also just do sandworm here and it'll take you right to it. And you click on that. You have to have your login information to access it this way remotely. If you're on site at SAPL, you can access this on any computer or at any of the branches also without a login information. And then you do browse and explore from this landing page. We only have access to Texas through MySAPL. These are all the Texas cities that you can look at too. So sometimes I give this presentation to realtors who are working not only in San Antonio, but might also be working in like Bernie, for example. But we're looking at, did this the hard way instead of just typing it, San Antonio. And then this shows you all the sets of maps. So these are all those volumes of maps that you can look at. So 1911 to 1924. And then once you're in the sets, you navigate by volume this way. And basically what you're looking for when you're looking in these sandworm maps is for the name of the street. So for example, I can't remember what volume it was in, but we were looking for Indo on our example. So volume 1 doesn't include Indo. Go to volume 2, the index sheet. I'm gonna think hard. Goodness. Let's go to Y. Oh, and there's Indo. So we know that Indo 100 to 347 is on page 214. There's no reason y'all should remember this, but it was 308 Indo. So let's go to sheet 214. If we go up to our thumbnail grid up here in the corner, it gives you the whole set of sheets. Oh goodness, I immediately forgot what the sheet number was, 213? 214, okay. So we look for sheet 214. Here's sheet 214. And here's Indo Street. I'm gonna rotate it so that we're looking north at the top of the page. And then there's our subject structure, 308 Indo. So Susan asked in the chat, will the maps include the newest street name on the search maps? No, so these maps are all based on what things were called at that time. And so for our subject, let me go back to our sheet here. For example, whoops. When I first looked up this structure, I started with 1912 first, and I couldn't find East French Place because I knew it as 241 East French Place. But when I looked up the most recent map, I found 241 East French with the information about Indo Street. So you kind of have to work backwards from there in order to find the earliest information. Does that make sense, Susan? All right, and I always hate talking about structures without actually showing them to you. So here's 241 East French Place. It's a little hard to tell in this screen grab, but this is a brick structure, just like we saw on that color map. And this was a really fun one to research too. Through some newspaper archive research, I found out that the person who bought this property, or who was an early owner of this property, considered himself an alchemist and did all of this like gold work in his house, just really interesting, fun things. George just asked me here, sorry, how did you discover the previous street name? Okay, so I'm gonna go through this one more time and then we might have to move on. So on maps, these are all maps by, so when it's 1912, that means this information was correct as of 1912. So I couldn't find, when I looked for East French Place, because this property currently is 241 East French Place. It wasn't listed as East French until this set of 1951 maps. But on that map, it showed a previous name. So it's here in parentheses, Indo Street. So then I needed to go back to the earlier maps and look up Indo Street instead of East French. And then I found the structure listed as 308 Indo Street. And that only happens for properties where there has been that street name change over time. So if the street name hadn't changed, or if the street name, like the street didn't previously exist, you're not going to find it in those earlier volumes of this. Okay, so now that we've gone through the sandworm maps, we know we have all of our addresses to look up, potential previous addresses, previous street names. We can move on to city directories. city directories are kind of like proto phone books, and you can look up information by both name of a resident or by street name. Online through MySAPL, you have 1877 through 1960 for available city directories, and they're available in that same databases link under Heritage Quest. And let's show you real quick. I like this. This is a different order of events than I usually do. So we'll go in here real quick, and you can either look up, looking up city directories, I don't think will get you there, but let's try. Nope. Okay, so what you want to look for is Heritage Quest, all one word. It's this Heritage Quest online link. And then once you're in Heritage Quest, the very first link next to this leaf is city directories. So to access city directories, you can look up information in this keyword search. I find this does not necessarily give me the information I'm looking for, but if you want to use this keyword search for San Antonio, you're going to do San Antonio, comma, Bear, Texas. This Arsenal one, I've never used it. I'm honestly not sure what all is listed there, but you want the most sort of general search term, San Antonio, Bear County, Texas, USA. But I prefer to skip that and go right to the directories themselves. So I go down to keyword search and I just type like nonsense in it to get me past this gateway page. And there's a link here that says browse images in this collection. Once you click on that, it generates this box. For city directories, you have access to every state in the US, which is fun if you're searching like maybe family homes or anything like that. Again, here's all the cities and counties that you can search. We're going to choose San Antonio. And then this gives you an idea of all the years. So 1877 through 1960. I think I put 1880 or something on that slide. That wasn't correct. But when you click on one, it generates a link. And then you can click on that link and it takes you into the directory. And once you're in the directory, if you want to navigate between years, you just go up to the year here and it allows you to choose different years within the San Antonio set. So we kind of went through this already. Once you're in there, you can choose the date in that top navigation. And then once you're in the directories, there's a lot of really interesting information you can find. So this structure, 1622 West Wasatch, was an individual landmark. I worked with this property owner, I think in 2019. It was like right before COVID, so I think 2019 or maybe early 2020, to designate his home. And he had some information about his structure. For example, he had names of previous owners. He had some really fun photos, like historic photos of the structure. But the fun thing about the designation process is that a staff member will go through and put together a little bit of an historic narrative for your structure, and you might be able to find out things that you didn't previously know. So for this example, I looked up West Wasatch Avenue and looked for the house number 1622, and it lists White Richard N. O circled means owner of the property. So if the O isn't there, that means that person was renting the property for this volume. And now that I had a name, I went to the other side of it. I just realized I had the foresight to bring a couple copies of the city directories. So this is the 1911 city directory. I brought this because it has really fun like advertisements on the front of it. So you can see here it says like Alfred Giles Company Architects. Alfred Giles is a really prominent architect here in San Antonio. City National Bank, Mission Lumber. It's just kind of fun. Here's an ad for Ed Steves and Sons, who were lumberyard and home builders here in town. And then this is a later copy that sort of doesn't have all the fun stuff on the cover of it. But I've heard somebody refer to this as the old crisscross, and it's because half the directory will have listings. So these pink pages are all listings by the street name. And then if you have a resident name like we do here, so we know to look up White Richard N., you can then go to the other part, crisscross that information, look up Richard N. White, and find out more information that way. I hope that makes sense to you all. So we looked up Richard N. White. Here we learned that his wife's name was Bess B, and he worked for R.N. White Co., so he had his own business. And here it just restates that his house was at 1622 West Wasatch. So if, for example, we were looking up Richard White, wanted to know more about him, we could look him up in the directory and find out that he lived at 1622 West Wasatch. And then just like a little fun anecdote for this, because I think this comes up later too in my presentation. I discovered through this course of research that Richard White was very briefly mayor of San Antonio. Like I'm talking 5 or 6 months. I think it was like April 1954 to February 1955 or something like this. So very briefly mayor of San Antonio. And that helped add a layer of eligibility for designation of this structure. So there's lots of other interesting information you can glean from city directories. Here you can see H. In our previous slide, I mentioned that O means owner. In this volume, so this is the 1909 city directory, owner was marked by H, which is like homeowner or household owner. Numbers appear at the end of listings. That's the number of residents that were living at that address. I find that really interesting. For example, we did a survey of shotgun houses in San Antonio, and we're talking structures that are typically 800 square feet or under, and you would see 6, 8 people living in these homes, and it gives a really interesting perspective on like changes in ideals for home ownership, like how people use their homes, the amount of space they felt they needed, things like this. I find that really interesting. In 1909, if there was an R after the name, that meant that person was renting the property. Sometimes we'll see house number rear, and that's either like a detached accessory dwelling or perhaps a split house where there were 2 primary residents of the property. For city directories, I want to say through like 1909 or 1911, there will be a C next to Black residents, and that's the only race identifier in the city directories early on. A lot of the other sort of race and ethnicity information, we mostly glean from last names, but for residents of color, that C would appear there after their names. And you can kind of see looking at this block that there were quite a few Black residents on this block. So if we, for example, were wanting to designate this whole block, one of the things that we might cite as part of its eligibility criteria is that it was a largely a community of color, and that's something that we want to acknowledge and celebrate as part of its designation. And then here we have a structure that says vacant, which is pretty self-explanatory, but also lets us know that there was a structure there at that time. Am I missing any questions or chats? Okay. There's some other information that you can find through city directories. You may find information about a resident's employer. So here it shows that this man was an employee of the San Antonio Transit Company, which was originally the trolley system here in town. Richard W. was a buyer for San Antonio Cattle Company, so he probably worked over in Cattleman Square. Robert B. was a student. And then not shown in these examples, for women whose husbands had passed away, we'll sometimes see their occupation listed as widow with their husband's name next to it. Very occasionally, like I think it's only happened a few times since I've been doing this kind of research, if their husband was like a prominent person, like maybe he was a prominent businessman, it would include a date of death for the husband. Does not happen very often. It's also a good way to find out of names of adult children living at home. So typically when you look up by address, it'll show like the primary person, like kind of treat it like how we do census now. Like there's one primary person listed at the address. And so it might only list that person's name. But then if you look in the names or directory by names, it'll list everybody with that last name and it'll include their address. And so you can kind of discern based on that address that they had adult children living in the home. A fun one to find is under construction, because that lets us know that that was the year of construction for that home or building. And then sometimes you'll see no response, which just denotes that the structure is there, but the resident either didn't like return their survey form or they weren't able to make contact with the person living at that house. Okay, that was a lot of information. Do you guys have any questions before we move on? I don't see anything in the chat yet. Okay, I'll keep an eye out, and Okay, yeah. Okay, so now we have a whole bunch of search parameters that we can use to look in newspaper research. We have all potential addresses, whether those were the current address or previous addresses we found through Sanborn maps. We have residence names, and we have employer names potentially also. So now we have like a real wide variety of search terms to move forward with. Through SAPL Online, you have access to Newspaper Archive, which is what our office primarily uses to look up historic newspapers. It includes the Light, the Express News, it includes the German newspaper with the name suddenly left my brain, I apologize. And then it also sometimes includes the Spanish language papers for San Antonio. You can also check Express News online. I find it more helpful for recent history, but it's definitely worth searching. For example, I often find information in some of their history columns or architecture columns. Y'all might be familiar with like Paula Allen or Scott. Oh, Scott Huddleston, I think is his last name. They'll do like little columns about historic properties for sale, or Paula will take questions from San Antonians about history, like sort of general city history. And I sometimes find good information to support my research in those columns. Or they also sometimes help me with these additional search terms that I can then go back and look at in the city directories and Sanborn maps, or look for other newspaper articles about it. The Portal to Texas History, if you're not familiar with, is managed by Texas State History Association, THSA, and they have both the Express News and also the San Antonio Register archives. So the Register was San Antonio's Black newspaper, so it was written by Black journalists for the Black community, and has a lot of information about, I think specifically because, the way that racism works in the US, a lot of the more prominent newspapers in town were very white serving, white focused. So somebody who was a prominent member of the Black community might not get the same kind of press in the Express News or in the Light as they would in the San Antonio Register. So if you know that you're looking at a Black family or a Black resident, it's always good to check those San Antonio Register archives. And then the Institute for Texan Cultures, even though their location isn't currently active, all of their online resources are still available. And they have the San Antonio Light photo collection. UNT, yes, Abra, thank you so much. I blanked on who managed Portal to Texas History. Yes, University of North Texas manages that one. Institute for Texan Cultures, so they have the San Antonio Light photo collection. If you've done newspaper research online, you might have noticed that a lot of the quality is lacking for newspaper scans, especially in larger newspaper archives that are maybe more focused on the content of the articles than they are on the photos and advertisements and things like that. So if you find a photo through your newspaper research that was published in the Light, you might be able to find sort of a higher quality scan of that through Institute for Texan Cultures. It's very hit or miss. It's also just a really fun collection to look through. Like, for example, we're just coming out of Fiesta. They have a really fun collection of historic photos of Fiesta, not just like the big events, but a lot of just fun street photography too, because of the newspaper coverage. So as an example of the kind of information you might find through your research in newspapers, this was an ad that I found for 247 East Summit Avenue. This is a house that's located in the Monte Vista Historic District, and this is from the Express, San Antonio Express in March 1940. And this is very like, I don't know, proto hashtag ad, social media-y kind of stuff that cracks me up when I find things like this. So Mrs. Otto Kaler, if you guys are familiar with Otto Kaler, he's the one who owned what is now the Pearl, so San Antonio Brewers Association. This is his wife, Emma Kaler. If you're not familiar with that whole saga, please Google Emma and Otto Kaler when you're done with this workshop today. But it says, shown in the photograph is Mrs. Otto Kaler with her new Buick convertible Phaeton parked in front of her new residence located at 247 East Summit Avenue. Miss Kaler states that she selected Buick because of its outstanding beauty, comfort, and ease of handling. So like really fun find, kind of a little silly, this very wealthy woman showing off her new car that she presumably got it for free or at a deep discount for placing this ad, but it shows her in front of her house at 247 East Summit Avenue. And the reason why this is really cool for those of us who do property research, especially who are doing it for design review reasons, is we have like a one-for-one look at what the property looked like early in its life versus now. So if, for example, the current property owner said, I want to remove and replace all of these railings and balustrades and posts on my porch. Like, I don't like them. I think they should be gone. And I want to replace them with like wood posts or something. Well, we have this record now that shows that these are original to the house. And so we might treat them differently. Like perhaps we would recommend if there's one that's broken that they repair it in kind. So with the same materials, with the same design, or we might recommend repair of it so that it can retain this historic feature that we know was pretty historic, if not original to the house. Something else that I find fun is you can see the two trees in the front yard, like they're little baby trees here. And this is a screen grab. I didn't put the year on this, but this is probably like 2020 or 2022. You can see how those trees survived and grew over time. I find stuff like that really fun. If this were my house, I would be really stoked to learn that these had been there that long and that they were part of sort of the original design, for their front yard. But yeah, so it's fun to find things like this. We'll talk a little bit later about like managing expectations for the kind of stuff you're going to find. But this is an example of the type of information you might find about a house. Here's another example, 843 Rigsby Avenue. This was actually the first house that I helped designate on behalf of the property owner. This is what we call an Asian influenced craftsman bungalow. You can see it has this kind of really beautifully flared gable on the front. It has these crossed rounded piers here, and then we call these battered piers, these stone piers here. Just a really beautiful house. It has sort of a vaguely Asian design for the wood window screens. And we found through research of this that this was like a show home for Highland Park, which is a neighborhood on the Near East Side, kind of a little bit south. Like Highland Park, Denver Heights are all sort of the same area on our historic East Side. And something that was really cool to me about this is the woman who owned this property, she had lived there since she was a child. And she did not recall it having this sort of pergola condition over the driveway. So it had this sort of porte cochere pergola over the driveway when it was first built that had been removed by the time that she moved in. But if a future property owner said, hey, I want to build a pergola, or like I want to recreate this historic condition on my house, we now have this photo that if they wanted to emulate this design, we could approve that administratively without any additional review because we know it was in historic condition and they're trying to restore that historic condition. There's a question in the chat. So Diane says, my interest is in the old Mexican-American neighborhoods on the west side of San Antonio, Ruiz Street, El Paso Street, etc., during the Depression, 1930s, where there was great poverty. Will there still be Sanborn records and city directories for that area? Absolutely, yes. So the Sanborn and city directories are only limited by what was basically the city limits at the time. So sometimes if you're looking at a property that's like very far one direction, like I'm thinking, for example, like west, like maybe like Somerset Road west, it's called Somerset because that used to be a town called Somerset, Texas. And so that was outside the city limits for a long time. So the Sanborn maps and the city directories are only bound by city limits. Oh, well, I take that back. City directories are only limited by city limits. Sanborns, I'm not sure if the coverage was dictated by like what the insurance company's coverage, because there are parts of town that aren't covered by Sanborn maps, even though we know that they existed. That's why it's so important to use the two tools sort of in conjunction with each other, because neither has complete information. So the Sanborn maps don't necessarily show every house in San Antonio for that year. Just like the city directory might not list every possible address you could look up in any volume of the city directory, if that makes sense. So I really talk about these things in union with one another because you're going to find the most information and the most accurate information when you use them together. I hope that makes sense. You'll definitely find city directory information in the 30s for the historic West Side. Sanborn map coverage is a little bit different, but depending on what street, like I know Ruiz Street and El Paso streets are covered there. A lot of the sand streets are covered in the 50s. So you might not have 1930s level information, but you'll be able to glean some information from the 50s maps. And then you can use the city directories to sort of fill in the missing information. Yeah, Barbara mentions here, all depends on section of street. So, without getting into the weeds, because as you use these resources more, you'll get to know kind of where their coverage is good, where their coverage isn't so great. You'll be looking at a street and the whole north side of the street will be covered for every volume of every year of Sanborn's, but then the south side of the street doesn't get covered. I assume because it wasn't covered by the insurance company. I'm not really sure. So it really does depend on where you're looking in the city. If you have any trouble, if you're looking for something specific, you're welcome to email me and I can try to help you find some good search terms. And then again, Debbie at the Taxonomy and Genealogy Library is also a great resource for stuff like this. But hopefully at the end of this, you guys will take some time to play around with the maps, play around in the city directories, so you can really get to know them and figure out where it's useful to you and where you sort of need other resources to fill in that information. Looking forward to you starting your research too. This is, once you get going on this stuff, it's hard to stop. So in addition to property level information, you can also sometimes find neighborhood level information, especially for sort of later developments. This, for example, Green Lawn Estates, this is a local historic district that was designated again in, I think, 2019. It's one of our newer historic districts. And this was an ad getting people to buy in early into the neighborhood. So it shows you like an example of a house you might find there, tells you what sort of amenities it has, shows you a location in relation to the rest of the city, some directions. And then for those who are interested in stuff like this, it also shows deed restrictions. So anyone who's familiar with sort of city development knows that there were a lot of race and income-based deed restrictions in neighborhoods. So sometimes the language is coded, sometimes it's not so coded. Here, for example, it says, assures construction of only better type homes. So it says, therefore, in keeping with the high character of this ideal suburban vicinity, the building restrictions, deed restrictions, are such as to definitely protect property owners and assure construction of only better types of homes. So I assume that if you looked into a deed for one of these properties, they would say something like, new construction must not be less than $5,000 or something like that. You might see language about it being a whites only neighborhood. Things like this are written into the deeds and then also sometimes found in these advertisements for the neighborhoods. This one also showed the company that was developing the neighborhood, which is really interesting to me. If you wanted to make connections to maybe other parts of San Antonio, perhaps this Miller Darrow company was responsible for other neighborhood developments in San Antonio. So this was an interesting case too. 215 Lowell was an individual landmark. This actually came to us as a request for demolition. And then we kind of built this interesting narrative about it, especially in relation to a house next door, that the property owner decided against demolition and it ended up rehabilitating the property. It's really beautiful if you want to go be creepy and drive by or look at it on Google Street View. The address is 215 Lowell. And it's located in the Roosevelt Park neighborhood. So in researching this property, we learned that it was previously owned and then initially developed by a man named Henry Shainfeld. And through researching his name, we learned that he opened a building trades night school, something really of interest to our office. We have our own Living Heritage Trades Academy, so that really resonated with us. We found evidence of him buying the property from R.H. Hunstock. If you've done property research in San Antonio, this might be a familiar name to you. He was a really prominent developer, owned a lot of land in San Antonio, sold a lot of land in San Antonio. So this is something that also kind of raises flags as far as eligibility of the neighborhood that the property contributes to. And then we learned that Henry, a building contractor, was injured when a scaffold on which he was standing in Lowell Street, or at 215 Lowell, gave way and precipitated him to the ground. He is severely bruised about the arms and body, and fear is entertained that he is internally injured. So in working on this property, we know that the contractor, the builder, was injured in the course of work. And then subsequently, he passed away from his injuries. And in his obituary, we learned that he was a well-known contractor. So it's somebody who was respected within the building community here in town. We learned that he emigrated to Austin. He was a German, I believe. Am I making that up? Came to San Antonio from Austin. I'm pretty sure he was a German or Austrian immigrant too, but maybe don't quote me on that. But in Austin, he was employed in the erection of the Driscoll Hotel. If you're not familiar, another Googleable, beautiful, beautiful hotel downtown, kind of a Richardsonian stone building, beautiful. And that he was also employed in building the state capitol building. So this is all stuff that sort of lends to the the eligibility of the structure for designation. Like we think that these contribute to this being an historic landmark. But yeah, native of Saxony, Germany. Okay, glad I kept reading. And then here's a picture of the photo of the structure. This was before it was rehabilitated. You can kind of see a little bit here to the right. There's another structure next door that's a little bit more intact. And Henry built both of these structures, and they're twins. And that was something else that we used to build a case for eligibility for designation. That it was one of this set of twin houses that really, like, it means something a little bit more when you have two houses built by the same person in the same style next to one another. They're like a little couple. Okay, so this is a little morbid, but there's a really interesting website. Oh, Susan, I'm going to answer your question real quick. Did you look up information about available utilities from the original house, such as water wells? Very occasionally, I see information about wells on Sanborn maps, but not reliably where that could be a place you could look for them. I'm not sure the best resource for that. But like I know I've seen some wells on commercial structures, particularly. I think probably your best bet for finding stuff like that might be historic aerials, which we'll look at in a little bit, or maybe some of the, I think aerials might be the best bet. But yeah, those aren't always indicated on Sanborn maps, rarely indicated, I would say, on Sanborn maps. Oh, and it looks like Alex is also a Find a Grave stan. So there are two websites that are really interesting to look at from like a genealogy perspective. Findagrave.com, and then there's another one called billiongraves.com. Usually if I can't find something on Find a Grave, I go to Billion Graves to check for it. And like maybe 6 out of 10 times I find it there. So we're going to go back to Mr. White. So this was our former mayor who lived on West Huisache in that cute little Spanish house. Through his obituary, I knew that he died in 1977, so I included that information because I have it. Not always necessary, it just kind of helps hone in, especially when you're working with really common names like White. And then when I browse, you can browse by specific cities, but there's a lot of movement around Texas, especially in and out of San Antonio. San Antonio is a business center for a lot of folks. You have military people coming in and out, so people are pretty transient through San Antonio over the years. And so I always cast a little bit wider net and search for Texas instead of San Antonio specifically. And then once I searched, I had one entry for Richard Nayland White. He's buried at Sunset Memorial here in San Antonio. And this is a really good way to kind of confirm things that you found also. So if you remember early on when we were looking at the city directories, when we crossed, we found Richard White listed under 1622 West Huisache, and then we looked him up by name. It showed his wife's name as Bess B. So here we have Bess B. We know that he had a Richard White Jr. son. And then it also includes a photo of the marker. If you have a family that maybe there's some like real like nerdy genealogist in the family, sometimes you'll get historic photos here. Sometimes it'll include obituary information, depending on who has. Let me back up. So Find a Grave is kind of like a wiki for cemetery information. So all of this is uploaded by volunteers who are out like walking cemeteries, cleaning cemeteries, whatever it might be. Again, it might be a family member who's trying to make sure all this information is uploaded and available to their family members, cousins, whatever. So all of this information is dependent on whether or not some human being has uploaded it into Find a Grave. Just all crowdsourced information. All right, any questions about that before we move on? Okay, let me make sure there's nothing in the Q&A chat. I think we're good. Okay, don't forget to drop questions either in the chat or in the Q&A tab if you have any. Unfortunately, I think this format doesn't allow you to ask questions verbally, but you'll have to type them in. Okay, let's move on to maps. We're kind of getting into like the real deep nerd stuff. Historic maps are a really good resource, especially to fill in blanks when stuff isn't covered by Sanborn maps, not covered by city directories. In our case, if we're just trying to determine whether a structure was even present in a certain year, these maps can be really helpful. So the Amon Carter Museum has 1873, 1886, and 1891 bird's eye maps of San Antonio. I will warn you that for some reason, this museum is remaking links all the time. And so their links often die between times that you use them. So I found the best way to use this resource is to go to the Amon Carter Museum website and then search for bird's eye maps of San Antonio. There are also 1909 street maps of San Antonio, and I honestly just find these by Googling 1909 San Antonio street map. They're very high res. You can search very closely into the maps. This is another good way to find information about street name changes. Also really interesting for like neighborhood names. I've occasionally found good search terms looking at these old maps because they'll have a neighborhood name on them that I hadn't previously heard of. And it just sort of increases your ability of finding more information if you have these kind of like one-off street name changes, neighborhood name changes, and things like that. And then there's also, City of San Antonio maps. This slide honestly is in here mostly for when I do our realtor training genealogy workshops, but these are also really helpful for property owners. So the one-stop map will show information about like your neighborhood association, what your city council district is, and then also zoning information. Maybe if you're looking to buy an historic property, you want to know whether that property is designated, whether it's located in like a neighborhood conservation district, maybe. That level of information you'll find on the one-stop map. You do have to toggle it on and off. So there's a navigation in the top left of the site where you can turn on the different layers like neighborhood conservation district, historic landmark, historic district. But the OHP Explorer map, you can quickly search for that information. So you don't have to toggle anything on or off for whether it's a landmark or in an historic district. And then it also lets you see whether work was reviewed by OHP, recent work. I would say this is probably like 2015 or later. If you are living in an historic home and you hire someone to do work and you want to confirm whether that scope of work was reviewed by our office prior to the start of work, this is one resource for you. If you're looking to buy a house and maybe something looks funky, you know, it's designated, you could look up on the OHP Explorer map whether there was a recent approval of a scope of work that matches the work that you're looking at. This is a resource that I love, historicaerials.com. This is not through SAPL, but it is a free resource as long as you don't have your ads blocked on your browser. And this set of maps or set of aerial photography is especially helpful to our office and helpful to you as researchers too. So the Sanborn maps end at 1952, and the historic aerials, they have maps from 1939 to 2022. So the information post 1952 you can find on the historic aerials. It's really helpful for us for determining dates of modification, like if something happened after 1952. For example, that house we looked at earlier that had the rear addition, if that rear addition hadn't appeared on that 1950s map, my next step would be to look at the historic aerials to see the earliest year it appears there, to give me an idea of when that was built. It's also really good for looking at neighborhood-wide information if you're interested in that. Maybe for Diane, who's looking in for the neighborhoods on the historic west side. This is a little bit older of a screen grab, so it doesn't show all the years that are available. Like I said, you can now do 1939 through 2022, but this 1955 year is still there. This is the fork of the Alazan and Apache Creeks on the near west side, the historic west side of San Antonio. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with, I don't know, I guess like weather history of San Antonio, but 2021 was the 100th anniversary of this huge, I mean, just city-changing flood, 1921, that just wreaked havoc, especially on our historic West Side neighborhoods in San Antonio. And it resulted in a lot of sort of like flood mitigation strategy later on, largely starting in the 1950s. A lot of the sort of mid-century like urban renewal projects were flood focused. The San Antonio River and Riverwalk are results of flood mitigation measures that were sort of taken into consideration after this huge 1921 flood and then a subsequent flood in the 50s. I want to say that was also 54, but don't quote me. But you can see here, this is a 1955 map of our historic west sides, the Alisana and Apache Creeks. And you can see the creeks kind of cutting through these neighborhoods, crossing over roads and whatnot. Like this one has a little, I'm pointing with my fingers if you can see me. You know, there's a bridge going over a branch of the creek here. And then after these sort of urban renewal flood mitigation measures, you can see how the neighborhood was impacted. So they basically expanded the edges of the creek beds, I guess with the thought that then those are structures that won't be damaged by those floods. I mean, the 1921 flood, the stories from it, and the 50s flood as well, you know, people waking up in 3 feet of water in their house, like very scary stuff. People died, people were gravely injured. But this flood mitigation, let's go back to 55, really changed this neighborhood. There was a lot of neighborhood loss through these urban renewal and flood mitigation projects. Okay. I said the maps were deep nerd, but deed and plat research is where really you can get in with some very deep nerdery. The Bexar County Clerk has a website where you can search for deeds or plats by name, address, legal description, which when you look up your address is that like NCB number, block number, lot number. That's a legal description. You might find names of first property owners or early property owners. You might find subsequent owners. Like on a good day, I've been able to trace like complete ownership history for a property. It probably happens 1 out of every 8 or 10 properties I look at. You might be able to learn who built the property and sometimes the architect, depending on whether that language is included in the deed. So sometimes you may find a deed of trust, which is a specific kind of deed that says, I give this person the right to build a home on my property designed by X, Y, and Z. Again, I found that maybe 1 out of 30 times I've researched something through deed research. And then who platted or replatted the neighborhood. We mentioned earlier R.H. Hunstock, who was a big developer. So a lot of the plats for his neighborhoods carry his name. They'll be called like the Hunstock edition or R.H. Hunstock's whatever neighborhood. So all the stuff that you might find through that research. This is going to be the one time I tell you to use bcad.org as a resource. Let me pull it up real quick. And then, so the Bexar County Appraisal District is the website that sort of houses all of your tax appraisal information. Online services. I don't know why I clicked that. Property search. I would do the classic version because it's what I'm used to. Let's look up 1622 West Research since we use that as an example. Because you're a captive audience, I'm going to tell you that the build date that they list on these things are rarely correct. So I think that in improvement building, it'll say these years. Please don't repeat these years to anybody unless you know it's true, because these are rarely correct on BCAD. But the one thing that BCAD is really helpful for is this very last tab says deed history. And it'll list up to the last 3 deed transfers. And you can use this information to go back to the Bexar County archive and search. So here we have like a document number, we have a volume and page number. And so when, pardon me while I go to my tabs here. So this is going to be linked at the end of this presentation. And I think somebody asked this and I didn't say it out loud, but yes, this presentation will be shared with you later on, both as a PDF, and then we're also recording this so you can watch it later. But when you go into advanced search, it has an option to search by legal description, property address, book, volume, page number, single document numbers. So for example, let's see if we can get this to work now that everybody's watching me. Single document numbers. search. It's going to think really hard. Yes, and this is that deed that we're looking at. So once you're in here, you can search back. So this is the grantor, the person who sold the property to the grantee. We go click on his name. It should also then show us who he purchased it from. Watching paint dry. Let's do recorded date. It's not going to show it. Okay, so here's the joy of the deed research thing too, is that all of these resources are compiled by human hands. And so sometimes it won't list, like maybe he has this listed as Hendrix, Hendrix, or something like this. So you have to be really flexible in the way you approach deed research because everything's entered by human beings who are prone to errors. You may not find anything. It's very it's a little bit like a wild goose chase, but really satisfying if you can find the information you need. Okay. Last thing I always recommend is just Googling the thing you're searching. So Google an address, a neighborhood name, a resident name, any sort of search term that you find in the course of your research, Google it and see what comes up. You might get articles from other cities, states, or countries. As an example, there was a property relatively recently that was owned by the Archdiocese that they wanted to demolish. It was in this area of town that was kind of in between Tobin Hill and Monte Vista. Really beautiful, clearly like wealthy person built it. And when it came to us as a demolition, we realized we needed to build a case for saving it. And I Googled the name of one of the residents and learned that he was like a vinegar magnate from Kentucky. And the state of Kentucky had all of these websites about him, like online databases about his family, all of his business ventures and things like that. So somebody who was clearly a prominent business person chose to uproot his business and move it to San Antonio. And that information helped us build a case for designation for that structure. And I wouldn't have found it if I had limited my research to that person in Texas. It was only because I literally typed his name into google.com that I found this wealth of information from the state of Kentucky. Family-specific genealogy websites are often really helpful. Thinking also specifically of like, San Antonio has a lot of like country of origin interest groups, thinking like your Canary Islanders or like Germans in Texas that have built huge genealogy websites based on those groups emigrating specifically to San Antonio. Those can be really helpful. Or again, if there's someone in someone's family who was really dedicated to documenting the history of their family, and then they publish a website about that, you're probably not going to find that through newspaper archive, but general Google search might get you there. It's also brought me to a lot of Institute of Texas and Cultures and Portal to Texas History information that for whatever reason, maybe my search terms weren't great when I went to those resources directly, but whatever I typed into Google just like hit it in a way that allowed me to access that information through other databases I know exist, but like just couldn't muster the right search terms for. And then other search results that can create leads that you can confirm using those other tools. So, once I have information about vinegar magnet from Kentucky, maybe I go back to newspaper archives and type in his name and the word vinegar, and now I have a whole bunch of new information about that person and their legacy in San Antonio. Kind of a silly example. Okay, Diane asks, is it possible to find the owner of rental property? Is there a way to find out residents who might have rented from a house owner? Just curious. Yeah, I think this is another situation where you have to really use these resources in conjunction with one another. So, you're going to find renter information in the city directories, but to find owner information, that's where you would look into the deed research for that, because the deeds are going to be the person who owned the property rather than rent the property. So you're going to be kind of looking at both ends there. Okay. Managing expectations. So, folks who have done property research, you are probably already familiar with this, but these tools aren't always going to tell you everything that you want to know about a property. You're not always going to be able to land on an exact year of construction. Often in my line of work, I'm using that pesky circa before a date because I know it existed in 1909. It might have been built in 1908, but I don't have anything confirming a build date any earlier than 1909. So I use that circa 1909. Rarely, honestly, are you going to find an architect or builder. You may not find who the house was built for, like a first resident. And there's a lot of factors that impact that ability as well. So when the home was built, if you're looking at a house that was built very early in San Antonio history, like, thinking like maybe right post-colonial times, like late 1700s, early 1800s, maybe that isn't going to be as well documented as a house that was built in 1910. If it was within city limits at the time, this kind of gets back to a question that was asked earlier in the chat. A property that was built in Somerset, Texas in 1895 is likely not going to be as well documented as a house of that age that was built in the King William neighborhood, for example. Who the home was built for. So, I'm thinking of neighborhoods on our historic east and west sides that were built as rental properties, built as income properties, and house a lot of, working poor or, just sort of normal middle class folks in those houses. Those are not going to be as well documented as the like giant mansion homes of King William, the wealthier homes in Lavaca and things like that. One, because the architect probably wasn't looking to sell properties that way through newspapers. And see Atlee Ayers, Alfred Giles homes in the newspapers because these were large investments from the property owners. They're like wealthy business people or whatever. They want press in the newspapers. They want folks to know how wealthy they are. Those things end up in the newspapers. Like a row of 2-bedroom, 1-bath homes built on, the historic West Side are probably not going to get the same press. And then I've already touched on this, but was there a prominent architect or builder of record? So oftentimes the more prominent homes, homes in King William, that Asian influence bungalow we saw that was an advertisement for Highland Park, if there's sort of a builder or an architect who is looking to advertise their work, that might have more coverage than sort of your normal, Joe Schmo house. Okay. Barbara mentioned, you can look at census data for full household info too. So census data is going to tell you more about the renters than it is about the owner, because that's sort of like a door-to-door survey, but also is a really good source of information as well. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how the Office of Historic Preservation uses these tools. Charlie shared a link for water well information. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. I haven't seen that before. I'll have to bookmark that. So the Office of Historic Preservation, we have these sort of like offices that are under the umbrella of OHP. The first one we'll talk about is Scout SA. There are primarily our designations arm of the office. They're the ones who are responsible for designating individual landmarks, designating historic districts, and then also creating cultural historic districts. So you may have heard recently about the Silk Road Cultural Heritage District that was just adopted by City Council. We're working on a Pride District that will be ratified soon, I'm sure. So they're responsible for all of these designations within the city of San Antonio. And they are using these tools to build cases for designation, for researching homes that the owners are requesting demolition. This is one of the tools we use to identify properties that are eligible for designation. The way it works in the city of San Antonio is that we don't seek designation for a structure unless the property owner wants it designated, or we receive a demolition request and we think that loss of that structure amounts to a loss of architectural or cultural history. So basically, if it meets these criteria, we're going to try to protect it. And then it also allows Scout SA to complete historic assessments and requests for review of contributing status, which is basically a tool that property owners can pay for to see how our public commission, the Historic and Design Review Commission, might respond to a request to demolish a structure in whole, or a request to remove maybe an accessory structure on a property that's located in an historic district. It sort of just lets them know whether we think that would be a successful request or not, or whether we think it would be protected by these designation tools. And we use these research tools to determine which, if any, of the 16 criteria the property we're reviewing meets under city code. And those criteria are sort of what you would expect. They fall into these general buckets. So affiliation with a prominent person, whether that's a resident or an architect, affiliation with a prominent event. For example, we had a house recently come up for designation because it was related to the planning of the first MLK March in San Antonio. Architectural style and construction methods, self-explanatory. Relationship to other properties nearby. This is something typically reserved for historic districts, but also helped us in that example of the house on Lowell, where it was sort of a twin to the house next door. San Antonio is one of the few cities in the nation that can cite cultural significance towards designation. Usually it's more about the built environment, but if, for example, the house that was related to the MLK March, maybe it wasn't like a specific style, maybe it didn't have an architect of record who was prominent, but we could use that cultural significance of its importance to San Antonio's Black community and planning of that march to sort of bolster designation requirements. And then also archaeological significance, which happens a lot with sort of colonial era San Antonio. And these criteria, they're based on the Secretary of Interior's criteria for National Register listing, so like the federal level designation, but are written through the lens of San Antonio history, which is why it's cool we can include things like cultural significance and then also archaeological significance. So the design review arm of the Office of Historic Preservation, they're the folks who are helping homeowners sort of manage changes to their historic properties, or maybe if somebody wants to build new construction in an historic district, they're the staff members that are helping sort of escort people through that review process. So this kind of research helps build our office's knowledge about neighborhood history. So if somebody wants to build a 2-story accessory structure in their backyard, but the pattern in the neighborhood from Sandworm maps is all 1-story accessory structures, that can help inform the advice that our staff gives to that property owner. Like maybe they'll have a more successful time pitching a 1-story accessory structure, that kind of stuff. Or in the case of the house that was on East French Place, there's that rear addition that we know happened by 1951. Now that we know it wasn't part of that 1912 footprint of the structure, like maybe staff would be a little more lenient about changes to that part. Maybe they use that information to decide it's an historic addition and should, be treated the same as the original footprint. This is all information that they can use to help inform those decisions. And then for my office, so I review all the private demolitions in the city of San Antonio for requirements for our deconstruction ordinance. So San Antonio is the largest city in North America, actually, to have a deconstruction ordinance, which requires that any residential structure that's an 8-plex or smaller, so like an 8-plex apartment complex or smaller, and then including any detached structures like a detached garage or, they have a mother-in-law suite in the back. Any of those structures that were built in 1945 or earlier citywide, or built in 1960 or earlier for our protected districts, which are historic districts, neighborhood conservation districts, and then individual landmarks, 1960 or earlier. So I'm using all of these tools to find that build date that triggers whether or not deconstruction is required in that case. And deconstruction just means sort of like the reverse of building it. They're dismantling the house or the residential structure from the roof down and trying to salvage as many reusable materials as possible. And then those materials, by and large, go into affordable housing projects here in the city, with some sort of outliers going towards other community impact projects and then some public art projects as well. And then this is my plea to you to share what you learn about whatever property you're researching. Our office has this really cool program called There's a Story Here, and it's a community-sourced map of history, whether that's cultural history, architectural history, something that is unique to your neighborhood or maybe your family. We have stuff on here that's as high level as like fiesta-related events to as personal as this is a place that my grandfather and I used to eat every Sunday when I was little. We really want to hear all the information that you find in the course of your research, whether it's related to your house or a building that's important to you. We would love if you shared it on this map. It's sapreservation.com/cache. All of these links to resources are going to be available online after the meeting, and this is just a link farm so that you can, build your own bookmarks and also access these things directly instead of searching for them. ScoutSA has built a really helpful website. If you go to scoutsa.com, it's one of the first links when you get past the landing page. And it's sort of a step-by-step guide, very similar to this workshop, of how to do that property research, and is a really good resource to use in conjunction with what you've learned today to do your property research going forward. And then this is my contact information. I see another question in chat. So Brenda asks, I want to know how to get designation on a property where our house used to be, right behind San Jose Mission. We were displaced so the visitor center could be built. Our property is now a parking lot. San Jose Mission is already designated. So, having another layer of designation might not necessarily help, but I think that this is where there's a story here. It could be really helpful. So this is, let me actually take you to the map. So you can submit any story online. Slash. So when you go to the map, so each of these little red flags is something that someone submitted about that property. So what I would recommend is, oh, great, that's great. And I recommend this, Brenda, because it's really hard to get designation for a structure that's not there anymore. And so we have to kind of find these alternates to commemorating that. Something else you might also want to consider, there's a sort of sister program called History Here that is another sort of crowdsourced marker program that actually results in a physical marker on site. I'm like a little hesitant to recommend this because I don't know how national parks would respond to it. But if you want to get some more formal, like interpretive materials on site about your family, if you have history that you want to share there, I would recommend talking to, her name's Allison at National Parks. I can't remember her last name off the top of my head. If you email me, I'll try to find it for you. But you'd want to talk to the folks on site about whether you may be able to install something like a history hair marker to commemorate your family's presence in that property, or maybe work with them to include it in some of their interpretive materials in the museum even. I think there's, oh great, I feel like everybody knows Allison. They want that information just as much as we do. There's also a descendants group related to the missions that you might want to reach out to. Allison will have contact information for them. She works really closely with them. And I think those are good routes to do. I mean, having a history hair marker at one of the missions would be super fun. My colleague Rachel Vitaliata manages that program, and I'm glad to put you in touch with her. All right, I flew through this today. Do y'all have any other questions you want? Oh, there's a bunch of stuff in chat. Set of newspapers with images. How would you recommend trying to locate a photo of a home at a certain point in historical time? So Leslie, this is one of those like expectation management exercises. Like very rarely are you going to find an historic photo of a structure, especially if it's, if it's outside of a mansion really, or these sort of one-off situations. For example, with that house in Highland Park, the Asian influence house, the reason we found that photo is because the developer was using it as sort of a showpiece for the neighborhood. But your sort of average San Antonio house, it's going to be very difficult to find an historic photo. If it's located in one of our historic districts, we might have a survey photo of it, but those are typically 1980s or newer. So that's a possibility. If you want to send your address to me, you can just email it to me and I can check if we have anything on file. But it's really difficult to find that kind of documentation for every house. But it's worth a shot reaching out to our office and then searching the address online, all the addresses that you find through your Sanborn research or through your city directory research. That's the best bet is going to be through newspapers. Tori says, I was interested in the part of the city that was Ward 2 in 1874. I'm not familiar with that off the top of my head, but if you want to email me more information, I can try to find out some more for you. Rebecca said, we're in Bexar County, not San Antonio. Would I look up San Antonio Sanborn maps? No. So for Bexar County, depending on when it was built, your best bet might be deed research. It's possible, depending on where it is in Bexar County, that it would be included in the city directories early on. Stuff that was outside city limits, whenever a city directory was built, sometimes the individual will be listed, but not necessarily the address. So it'll be someone's name listed at like the northeast corner of Somerset and some streets. Like it won't even have a street address there. So I think city directories might be helpful depending on where it was, but the deed research might be most helpful to you. They could be covered in newspapers too, since that was sort of area news. We worked on a house that was outside 1604 that was built in like the 1860s or 1870s, and it wasn't included in Sanborn maps because it was so far north, but the owner information was included in city directories, and then we also found a lot of information in newspaper research too, even though it wasn't inside city limits. Who might collect digital copies of old black and white photos of business places that don't exist any longer? So Diane, I think that's another place where newspaper research would be helpful to you. You might also want to reach out to ITC, Institute of Texts and Cultures, for that San Antonio Light archive. And business places don't exist. I mean, newspapers are really your best bet. The Conservation Society of San Antonio has some photos online as well. They have a digital database. I think they have probably more in their library than they have digitally. So if you check their website, which is saconservation.org, and they don't have it in their online like digital database, I would reach out to them either by phone or by email and see if their librarian, Beth, has any property files or any topic files related to it. I think if it was a specific business, like I'm trying to think, like I know people have done research on, for example, like gas stations historically in San Antonio and have collected old advertisements, which might include photos. So maybe depending on the type of business too would impact how well it's covered. But yeah, I think newspaper research is your first best bet, and then reaching out either to ITC or, I keep calling it ITC, but it's actually the UTSA digital archives that are housed through the ITC website, I believe. But yeah, search there, and I think that's a good first point, and then maybe reach out to Conservation Society as a second. Julie said we reached out to the descendants of the house and they have photos now. Yeah, I worked with property owners who, they're buying their homes from other house proud people and often inherit earlier photos of the homes that they live in. That's a great idea. Oh, Diane said, these are photos that I own and I would like to share. Sorry, I wasn't clear. Yeah, Conservation Society, I think will accept those. The librarian's name is Beth. I would ask for her specifically to see if that's something that she wants. We don't really have the capacity to keep it archived, so we really rely on community organizations to keep track of that stuff. I would also, I guess typically recommend ITC, but they are moving right now, so not a great time to bug them. But yeah, Conservation Society for those for sure. Susan asked, do we get a certificate for this session or do we? This is not a certificate session. Maybe I'll do that in future. That's a good thing to keep in mind, but this is mostly just for community benefit. I think it's really important for citizens to have this information and know that these tools are available to everybody, that they're fairly straightforward, fairly usable once you get sort of over the hump of learning the language of each option. The folks who are living in these homes, living in these neighborhoods, you all are the best keepers of the histories of those neighborhoods. And I really want our work to demystify this process for y'all and hopefully make you feel compelled to do your own research and help us flesh out these histories more than we ever could. All right, well, I'm going to stick around just for a little bit if you guys have any questions. Thank you for the kind words, guys. I had us booked till 1:30, so yeah, I'll stick around for a few more minutes if you have questions. There's a question in the chat. Are there any major differences in researching businesses versus residents? For example, what businesses used to be in a certain building? Not really, because if you have addresses from the Sanborn maps, you're using the same tools for businesses as you are for looking up residences. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear in that, but yeah, it's the same information. I think where you might find some differences would be in like deed research, because the company name may not appear in the deed research. It may be deeded only to like the business owner. So you have to be kind of flexible in your search terms there, where you might want to search both a known business owner, but then also the business name. And I didn't sort of go too deep into this, but with the deed research, you have to be really you have to kind of think critically about all the different ways a human being might choose to represent a word also. Like if I'm looking up a business name that ends in company, I'm going to look up COMP, and company spelled out, because I have no idea how they're going to choose to reflect that. in the deed research when they enter that information manually. So you just kind of have to think creatively about those search terms also. I think that would be my only, I mean, and that's true of people names too. Like I mentioned with Hendricks, that property owner spells his name RYX, but if I were doing deed research, I might look up RIX as well. Thanks, Marcy. Thanks, Diane. So Julie asked, historical neighborhoods, is it true it doesn't have to be the entire neighborhood, just a portion? If you're talking about historic districts, that's true. So for example, Dignity Hill, the neighborhood is much larger than Dignity Hill, the historic district. That's true for Monticello Park and Monte Vista as well. Tobin Hill has a couple of phases of historic districts and it still doesn't account for the whole neighborhood. The way that designation works in the city of San Antonio is at least 50% of the proposed neighborhood. Oh, thank you. Someone just delivered ice cream to me. What a treat. At least 50% of the property owners in the proposed district have to agree to be designated. And so sometimes people kind of design their district under that constraint, I guess. So if they don't think that all of Monte Vista is going to buy into being an historic district, they might choose a few streets that they know they can reach that 50%. That was kind of a little bit in the weeds. I apologize. George asked, who at the main library can help look up a property? So the Texana and Genealogy room at the public library, they right now are located on the first floor of the Central Library downtown. Debbie there is one of the most knowledgeable property researchers I've ever met. She's who I go to when I get stuck. She's the person that will answer your emails if you write to ask for those 1930s maps. And she's a wonderful source of information. She works on site there. I can't remember her schedule off the top of my head, but if you drop by the Texana and Genealogy room in person, anybody at that front desk should be able to help you. But Debbie is especially proficient. Yeah, we'll be glad to email you slides or we'll post them. I'll email them to everybody who signed up for it. Yeah, and then we're going to post the recorded video as well. Thank you. All right. And if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to call or email me. My direct line is on here, my email address. I'm glad to answer these questions. If you guys have any organizations that you think would appreciate this presentation, I also have a road show that I'm glad to bring, or I can do another online workshop specifically for your group. Just reach out to me and ask, and we'll figure it out. Thank you all so much for coming, and enjoy your weekend.